everyone to this second installment of the Sustainability Speaker Series. So we have started with a speaker series focusing on what we can do about climate change and actions. And I had the luck to have been approached by Misha Mazia, who is a local farmer and runs his own business in town, the Shady Corner Farm. And I'm doing home composting since many, many years. I moved to Boston 16 years ago. I have my own 3-bin system in the backyard. I have regular kind of like harvest of real good soil that I mend to my plants and to my vegetables. So this talk will be taped by Dover Sherborn Cable TV to be a resource for everyone who wants to learn about this. And thanks for coming today. And I hand it over to Grisha.
Appreciate it. How are you guys doing?
Good.
Can you guys let me know kind of what your backgrounds are, just approximately farming or gardening or landscaping, and kind of what your interests are in the area, just so I have context of who's here.
I'm a home gardener, and I do whatever the boss tells me to do.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. See out of trouble?
Yeah, but we have got a large garden now because we just put up the big deer fence and we can plant anything we want. So now we're feeling a little wild and crazy. And, you know, instead of buying a bag of amendment, we want to build our own amendments.
Right. That's fair. Anyone else?
I'm a home gardener too. I've got a vegetable garden and also flowers and plants. And I'm starting a bee-friendly garden, butterfly garden.
Oh, okay. There's some talk of the bee corridor, right? Okay. Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Well, thank you, Dorothea, for putting it on. I'm glad you guys are all here. I'm glad people are interested in composting. I don't know everything there is to know about composting, but I'm happy to share, what I do know. So what I'll do is I'll give just a kind of an overview of what composting is and how the process works. And then I'll talk about a few different methods of composting, some of which, or most of which, you guys can do at home. And then we'll, have some questions and answers and so forth. So just at a high level, composting is just a natural decomposition of organic materials. And by organic, I mean things that were at one point alive. So it could be, banana peel from the kitchen, or it could be an old leather glove or a pile of leaves, anything that was once alive. And when I think about composting, I think less about the materials, and I think more about like what's actually happening. So, do you guys, anyone here have pets or animals that they keep?
Yeah.
So, if you have a dog or a cat or a cow or whatever it may be, they all kind of work the same in that they need certain things to be happy, right? They need air to breathe, they need water to drink, and they need food to eat. So when I think about composting, I think less about like all the different materials, and I think about the small microbes that you can't see with your eye, but they're there doing the work of composting. And for them to be effective and efficient, they need to be kept happy, just like your cat or your dog. So that's how I think about it, and that's a really good way to troubleshoot if you do come across problems, is why are they not happy? So just like an animal, compost needs to be like somewhat moist. It needs to have some water in it. It needs to have air to breathe, which is just a matter of like fluffing up your compost pile or putting air into it. And then it needs food. And some of you may have heard of this thing called the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So carbon to nitrogen is sort of the recipe for compost to be well fed and happy and to digest well. And common sources of carbon are things that are like really dead, which could be cardboard or tissue paper or leaves or wood chips, things that are like really, it's almost like crumbly. And then nitrogen are things that are just very recently dead. So it could be grass clippings, it could be, food from your kitchen or whatever it may be. And combining that, usually you want a lot of the carbon, the dead stuff, and a little bit of the nitrogen, which is the living stuff. So, and what happens is the living stuff has these microbes in it, and it sort of activates the pile, and the carbon is their food source. So you activate the pile with the nitrogen sources, and you feed the pile over time with the carbon sources. Does that make a little bit of sense? Yeah. So when the composting happens, you have the inputs, you have the carbon, the nitrogen, and then and the water and air, and you have the outputs. So the outputs are this compost material, which is kind of like a earthy material, which is very nutritious, and then you also have CO2. And the CO2, just like with humans or animals, when they breathe in oxygen and they digest their food, they breathe out CO2. So some people hear, CO2 is like, oh, that's not that good, right? But when you think about it in relation to what it could be, it's actually really good. So if you take CO2 and you put it in a greenhouse, whether it's a greenhouse in your backyard or a greenhouse that's our planet, greenhouse gases, it produces 1 unit of heat. And if you were to take that same yard waste or food waste and have it go into the landfill, where it digests without oxygen, where it basically rots, it produces methane instead of carbon dioxide. So I don't want to get too much into the chemistry, but at a high level, if you're composting, it produces a gas that produces 1 unit of heat, and if you're going to the landfill, it produces methane, which is, maybe you probably know better, it's either somewhere between 30 to 80 times more absorbent of the solar heat than carbon dioxide. I've seen different numbers online, but so it makes a really big difference to greenhouse gas emissions when you're composting and producing CO2 opposed to methane from the dump. So that promoting the act of composting is a nice way to reduce greenhouse gases and to lower the temperatures. So I'll just go to the next slide. I'm going to start with, I guess, the smallest scale and in some way the easiest way to compost, and then I'll go through each one and kind of discuss how it works. So if you live in an apartment or a townhouse where you don't have great access to an outdoor space, then they have these worm bin systems where you essentially layer in little bits of the food that compost is used to having. So like your napkins from your kitchen and your food scraps from your dinner. And then you introduce worms to it, which work like composting microbes, but you can actually see them. And they eat the material and they produce like these castings that are basically the same as compost. And the way the bins work is you have one bin at the bottom, and then you have a bunch of bins on top that have small holes. So the worms go up to the next layer of food, they eat it, all of the material drops down, you take that out, and then you're constantly rotating these bins. And what's cool about worms is that every 60 days, their population doubles. So like once you start the process, it just keeps going and going and getting better. So a little bit more advanced version of composting is doing what's called a tumbler. And a tumbler it's something you would do in a smaller backyard where you have some space, but you want to keep it really well contained against children or animals or whatnot. And the way it works is you combine the same materials, with that kind of ratio of a lot of carbon and a little bit of nitrogen, and you add air to it by tumbling it once a day or once every couple of days. And some of them have 2 separate sections, so you can have one going and get it and let it finish while you start another one. So for most people, this is a really nice option because it doesn't create a mess, and it's contained against like raccoons and squirrels and so forth that can cause a nuisance in your yard. So that's a pretty popular method. A more intensive method, and this is maybe for a small farm or for a larger backyard, is what's called a bin system. And a bin system is a way to do it on a slightly larger scale. So if you have more animals or a bigger family and you have some space to do it in the backyard, you would combine these materials again with a lot of carbon and a little bit of nitrogen in these bins. When one bin fills up, you would transfer it to the next bin, and when you transfer it, you're creating more space, and you're also adding oxygen to the whole mixture. So it's kind of maybe you take a month to fill up the first bin, and then you transfer it over, and so you have, a constant source of new material and a constant source of fresh compost to use. So that's, depending on your yard, if you have maybe half an acre or so, it's a good method to do it. And what I really like about compost in terms of kind of just saving resources and space is that when let's say you fill up one of these bins, by the time that it's done, the amount of material that'll be left will be half or less of the volume. So just by doing it, you're kind of getting rid of it, So that's kind of an intermediate way to do it. And this is what's called windrow composting, and it's a more commercial way. And it's the same basic process of combining the carbon sources and the nitrogen sources. And what's happening here is that machine is every day or every couple of days, it's mixing up all of the material. And what that does is it breaks it down to be smaller pieces, and it also constantly introduces oxygen to it. Because the problem most people have is that there's not enough oxygen for those little microbes to breathe. And so, one way or another, you have to introduce oxygen to it. So I'll take a little break there, and I'm curious to see if anybody has any questions. Who here does, yes, go ahead.
I was going to say a quick comment. So an advantage I see to composting materials that you have is you know what you're getting. So for the large-scale commercial composting like this, I have a bunch of clients who have cafeterias on site at their facilities, and they've done composting. But they will take everything from food waste to the packaging for frozen foods that's printed with inks. All that goes into the compost.
Yeah.
And I don't know that you really want to be eating inks, but
No.
it does break down. It's on paper, and it ends up as little teeny pieces of ink in the pile there. But when you do it at home, you know what you're putting into it if you're eating it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because from my experience, not all compost is created equal. And so just like give you an example, a lot of facilities will take in things that may have ink on them, or maybe there's some glass in there or plastic, and you can either have like the composting process happen, side by side with that foreign material, and then once the compostable material breaks down, you screen out the foreign material. That's, I think, a decent way to do it. It's not ideal, but at least you're screening out foreign things. So, like for example, maybe keeping the ink on the packaging and then getting rid of the packaging and the ink together. Some places, unfortunately, when they get everything under the sun, they'll grind it down to help decompose and also just to sort of eliminate the visual aspect of it. And at that point, when you can't see it and it's very small, it does come back to your garden. So if you're using it especially to grow food, then you have to sort of make a decision on which material you pick, because it may have things that you don't want to get into your food system. If you're the town of Sherborn or Natick and you're redoing the sidewalk and you want to fill in some soil to plant the grass, then maybe that's a better application for compost that has ink in it, where you're not sort of directly eating it, but at least you're sequestering some of the carbon. So, and then some facilities just don't accept things that may have things like ink or plastic. So it's good to know kind of who you're getting your material from, you know. I do my own operation in a very simple way. It's just kind of yard waste and then horse waste. So it's not, some people would say maybe it's not as diverse as other material that has, you know, food waste or cardboard or whatnot. But it's, at least I know, like it's clean of foreign objects and substances like paints and chemicals and so forth.
So, like most people here in Sherborn, I've been using oak leaves for my carbon, and then I read that oak leaves are particularly acidic and might produce acidic compost and might change the pH of the soils.
Yeah.
Is that something to worry about?
I would say no. Generally, when compost finishes, it becomes neutral. So that's a good way of testing whether compost is finished, is you do the, you know, that's one of the criteria. So the type of leaf doesn't affect the pH as long as it's a finished process. You know, it's a good question. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, so I think that 3-bin system looks very intriguing, but something that's in the back of my mind is how do you keep out your unwanted little investigators like skunks or raccoons? I mean, do you use wire? Do you have that problem?
I think it's case by case.
Yeah.
You know, if you have a problem with critters, then you probably would use like a more enclosed system. Or if you, depending on the critter, if you incorporated all of the attractive things to the critters deeper into the pile and put in like a layer of leaves on top, then that might help.
Yeah.
Or, you know, depending on, you know, for example, a lot of people will have chickens along with their compost, so the material is composting and their chickens are eating it and sort of digesting it at the same time. So just because, you know, if a raccoon gets in there and eats a banana peel, it doesn't really harm anything in theory.
It's really skunks I'm thinking of.
Yeah, right. So yeah, if you have a problem, you want to do like more an enclosed type of system. Yeah. For some reason, my projector stopped syncing with the. I think it's a different screen on my monitor, but anyways. So, yeah, I really enjoyed composting, and I think it's something that everyone can pretty much do at home. And if you can't do it at home, then there's a lot of services now for compost. And you can also use it for just about anything. You can use it for top dressing your lawn. You can use it for planting vegetables. You can use it for planting flowers. You can use it as a mulch. So, and you also save on people having to come pick up your waste, you know, whether it's yard waste or kitchen waste. And I think there's a lot of conversations about, you know, reducing greenhouse gases and having a lower carbon footprint. And sometimes it's hard to like make an impact on that, but this is one way where you're 100% making a direct impact on something like that if you care about it. Yes.
So if you're using a tumbler, are there certain kitchen waste products that are particularly good when you've got a small amount of compost?
Yeah.
Or ones that are particularly bad that you shouldn't put in?
I think if you're using a tumbler, you have a limited amount of space, you know, just inside that tumbler. So you would prioritize material that breaks down a little bit quicker, a little bit easier. So things like vegetable products, like a potato peel or a banana peel or anything like that, breaks down a lot easier. Oh, I don't know what it did. Others, and like opposed to like bones, you know, like a chicken bone or something, that'll take a lot longer to break down. So if you had to choose one, you would choose something that's like fleshy vegetable. That'll break down the quickest.
Yeah, maybe you'll get more into the mechanics of this, but I suspect this is true for most people in town. The waste stream is not constant. That is, you get a lot of leaves in October, you get grass clippings in the summer.
Yeah.
And then 2 or 3 gallons of food waste every week throughout the
Yeah.
year. So, the ratio of carbon and nitrogen is always going to be changing. So how do you,
Yeah.
how much leeway is
I
that?
think the easiest way to do it, if you were to do it in your yard, and if you had a little bit of space, is to mound up all of your leaves, and then that's the carbon, and as you get sources of nitrogen, like your food waste, which kind of comes out of your kitchen once a week or once a day, you just constantly add. You have a pile going, let's say bin, and you constantly mix the ratio, some from your kitchen, some from the big leaf pile. And then, in the summer, grass it's a good source of nitrogen, so you would mix that in with the leaves if you collect the grass. But it is a little bit tricky. You need a little bit of space, or you have to get creative with your carbon sources. So, for example, if you don't have leaves, you can use paper towels or tissues or newspaper or wood chips, or lint from your dryer is a good one.
How frequently should you be turning it to get oxygen?
It depends a little bit on the makeup of the pile, but just going back to my first point about them being living, breathing microbes, you want them to pretty much always have oxygen. So, but no more than once a day. Once a day maybe even a little too much. Once a week probably, realistically, if you have a tumbler or if you have a 3-bin system like that. So if you're a home gardener, depending on what you use for fertilizer, having a nice batch of compost will practically reduce any need for fertilizer if you do, use fertilizer you have in the past. Which is also, a nice benefit because you're not putting any sort of chemicals into your property, which eventually will wash down into your well and then go back into your faucet. Another interesting thing about compost that I really like is that it absorbs about 5 times its weight in water, and it's really good for, when you're planting, if you put that by the roots and you water it, instead of the water just kind of draining past the plant after a short amount of time, it stays there, and that's why it's so good for new plantings, because it gives the plant a chance to absorb the water over time instead of only when you're watering it. And compost is also used around like construction sites and so forth, but they don't want things from the site leaching away. So it's a nice kind of sponge, sort of a healthy sponge for the soil. Yes?
So is there an advantage to producing compost on, say, a lawn? Because is it slower release of nutrients? Because sometimes the problem with fertilizing is if it rains right after you fertilize, it rains too heavily, it just washes through the soil fast.
Yeah, it's definitely a slower release. It kind of just feeds the plant over time because it absorbs slower too. And like to my point of absorbing 5 times more water, when it does rain, even whatever else is in the soil doesn't get washed away as quickly. So it kind of benefits all around. It's really good for new grass installations. I had some clients that are landscapers and they liked it a lot. Because it keeps the seed there. Because when you have one of those heavy rains, you get those little tiny rivers in your lawn. Everything gets washed away and it feels a little defeating. Does anyone compost now? Up there? How do you get?
Embarrassed to call it I do compost.
How do people do it? How do you do it? The bins?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't turn it enough.
Yeah. Yeah. Do it, once every couple of weeks is probably okay. Yes, George.
Appreciate it. If you had I'll call it a compost pile, meaning it's what you would put in compost, but you've never turned, and it's large, and it's been sitting for 5 or more years. Does it make I don't know what value there is or it has been lost. Does it make sense to turn it now? Well, can you do things years later that will improve the quality?
So if you take, for example, like a really advanced professional composting facility, they will optimize the air and the food ratio and the water and so forth. And at best, they'll get to a finished product in about 6 months. And that's really like high tech, really pushing it, 6 months. And if you're kind of doing it, you know, sort of as a passive thing that you like do it once in a while, but you're not really professional about it, probably take you between 1 and 2 years for the material to finish, depending on what it is. Eventually everything composts just like it does, you know, in the forest and in nature. So if it's been sitting for 4 or 5 plus years, it's definitely composted. There's not much more breakdown to happen.
Is it less valuable than it would have been had you been working at it all along?
No. Well, there's two kind of couple variables. I would say the value of it depends on what originally was in it, what the ingredients were, and the other variable is the process that it went through. So, for example, if you made a pile and then there's some dandelion seeds that get into the pile, just, you know, by the process of things, and if the pile wasn't properly managed where it heated up to a certain temperature and cooled back down, heated up again. So when compost is heated to 131 degrees, that's kind of the industry standard, that kills all pathogens and diseases and weed seeds. So if you built a pile and everything is fully digested, but the weed seeds, you know, weren't properly cared for in terms of getting it really hot, then that may take a little bit of value away from the material, depending on how it was processed. So that's, you know, a lot of people want compost, but they don't want, besides plastics and glass and things, they also don't want weed seeds, you know, especially if they're putting it onto their garden or their lawn. So one of the processes that has to happen for professional composters, you have to monitor the temperatures and make sure it stays above a certain level for a certain amount of time. And that's impossible to do at home because you need really big piles to get to 130 degrees. But that, you know, that pile may get a little bit warmer in the middle. So anything less than six feet tall, it's not going to get super hot. So there's definitely value in it, some value potentially, depending on what's in it and how it was managed. But it's definitely nutritious, you know. So it's amazing, you know, if you go to a compost facility or if you happen to build a bigger pile at home. Like I have one of these really long thermometers for testing the compost. And even in the middle of winter with snow everywhere and, you know, it's freezing cold, you test it and it'll be 130, 140 degrees, which is just amazing because it's just nature working. You know, all these microbes are just eating and drinking and producing CO2. Just because you're mimicking nature, what's happening in the forest, but you're doing it, you're kind of just guiding it a little bit and just concentrating it in your own way. So same thing, you can do it at home, just on a smaller scale. Yes?
Question about kitchen waste.
Yeah.
I'm thinking in particular of containers that we either get from the grocery store or maybe with carry-out food, made out of material that feels kind of like cardboard, and it's labeled compostable.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, is it more environmentally responsible to compost it, or should I just recycle it with other paper goods?
In my opinion, I think composting is the better source. I mean, the better process, because I feel like when you compost it, all of it gets reused. You know, because it'll break down through the composting process. You put it in the ground, a plant takes the energy out of it and makes a plant again. With recycling, you know, I think there's a little bit more like leakage of material throughout the whole process. So I think I would use that as a carbon source. So things like in the same category as leaves and paper towels and so forth. So it's nice to see that, you know, companies are doing something about it and not just using plastic and using a, you know, more sustainable material.
So I'm on the industrial side of this, not for composting, but for managing industrial materials. So I'm always pursuing questions like, what does compostable mean? What is in it? So I had a chance to attend kind of a worldwide seminar on compostable plastics. Plastics for putting compost in, for disposing of. And I've been asking these questions for years, and this was the first thing I attended where so many people were asking that eventually the people who produce it revealed that not everything in there is something that would typically be part of compost. Sometimes it's just that it will break apart into smaller pieces. So I agree with you that it's still probably a more efficient thing to compost it at home and then use it for beneficial use. Because, right, the big system, things get lost, or who knows what.
Right.
They get contaminated along the way, they can't use them, it's dumped somewhere. You know, depending on if you're using it for food and how sensitive you are to what is truly in the material, that's, you know, that's where it gets a little trickier. And some of the things they say are only compostable in these kind of larger industrial settings.
Right.
It's very intensified in management. So it doesn't make it easy, but just think about it.
Another thing that I try to keep in mind is with composting and just any sort of like sustainable thoughts is every time you move something, you know, you're adding to the problem instead of the solution. So for example, you know, the material in the compostable packaging may be compostable, maybe it's not 100% compostable, but if you recycle it, it's going to burn a lot of fossil fuels to get from your house to the one place, get from one place to the next place, and that makes a pretty big difference. If it goes from your kitchen to your compost pile, you know, zero oil or gas burned. But obviously you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt because maybe it's a material that just it's not going to compost. But if there's a chance, then I would probably err towards not putting it in a truck again. You know.
Yeah, if it says compostable, I think you'll compost. It might not all be beneficial nutrients in there, but...
Right. That can go in like the sort of, you know, feeding your lawn section of the compost pile opposed to maybe your vegetable garden section. But yeah, I am a little skeptical of all the compostable plastics because there's got to be a lot of stuff in there just to keep it all together that isn't that good for you.
And they are looking at it from the standpoint of it not interfering with these larger operations.
Yeah.
Just that it will get into small pieces.
Something that I've been working on is trying to figure out like the delivery of compost. So you can deliver it in a truck, which is pretty straightforward, you know, minus the gas that the truck uses. But if you want to deliver it in bags, which is what most, you know, homeowner types want, you've got to deliver it in a bag that can sit out in the driveway for like a few weeks and get rained on and not fall apart. So then it's hard to use paper. Now we use paper, but which is a more renewable material, but you really can't use paper because it's going to disintegrate in the person's driveway. So you have to use something, you know, that is maybe not compostable. And that's a really tricky question because you're doing something good by composting, you know, food scraps and so forth and yard waste, but you're delivering it in something that's sort of part of the problem. And I'm not sure anyone's really figured it out yet. People have started to use like coated materials and lined, like paper materials that are lined with some sort of thin layer of plastic. It's really tricky, but I'd love to find a packaging material that is, you know, sustainable.
Everybody would.
Yeah. Well, I mean, for things that are constantly stored indoors, I think it's a lot easier. You can use paper. But things that have to withstand the elements, it's a little bit harder to use paper. But at some point, maybe somebody will figure out some waterproof paper or something like that. Okay, yeah.
If you're going to add leaves to the pile, is it advantageous to mulch them first? Will that speed things up, or is that not really necessary?
Yes, yeah, it would definitely be advantageous to accelerating the breakdown. So the composting that I do, I work mostly with landscapers, and they will, suck the leaves up from their customers' houses, and it goes through an impeller, and the impeller chops up the leaves, then it goes into the truck. And instead of a whole leaf kind of breaking down over time, just in terms of smaller pieces, if you mulch it or if you have it, go through a leach bag, that definitely accelerates the process. One minor negative to that is that when you have much smaller particles, they're more likely to be more compressed. And when they're more compressed, there's less oxygen that goes through the whole pile. So if you're using a more kind of dense material, you want to keep that in mind and maybe turn it over a little bit more often than you would if it was just kind of like unbroken leaves. Yes?
Could you repeat the ratio again of carbon to nitrogen that you're shooting for?
So it should be 30 to 1. 30 parts, things like leaves and paper and cardboard, and then 1 part nitrogen, food waste, or grass waste, or manure, if you have like a horse farm or something like that, or a pig farm or chicken farm. So, yeah.
So I don't know if you already covered it, sorry about this. But my main goal for composting is food waste. I have like 200 goals up there, and I've just heard you talk about like cardboard and stuff like that. Will it be successful if I'm just planning to just do food waste alone?
So maybe you missed the beginning, but you would definitely be successful.
Okay.
The important thing is to have an appropriate ratio of food waste to what's called carbon. So a source of carbon is something that's very dead. It could be leaves, wood chips, paper, things like that. So if you have a little bit of food waste and you mix it with a lot of, for example, leaves or wood chips, then you would get all of the process like really fired up and it would digest well. What kind of food waste do you?
Just I have tiny humans, and I'm like, we have to stop this food waste.
Yeah.
Just compost it. So, like, that's the only thing I can't think of composting right now. I mean, I'm not big on yard work, so I'm not sure. But if I need it, I will eventually do it. But right
Yeah.
now, that's the only thing in my head. I'm just like, I need to compost this. So.
Yeah. Yeah, start with a smaller process, and then as you get the hang of it, you get a bigger process, and you could compost everything you produce, depending on the amount of space you have. So I'll give you guys a fun number, sort of fun. On average, each person in the US wastes 1 pound of food every day. And I think, depending on how many people, it adds up to something like 100 million tons every year. That's just food waste. So if everyone could compost even a few ounces of food a day, make a pretty big difference in how much food gets wasted, and then also how many greenhouse gases get emitted. So that's a big part of it's a big part of reducing greenhouse gases, and it's something that everyone can do fairly easily. And if everyone does just a little bit, it makes a really big impact.
Is that number just the edible part of the food, or does it include banana peels and onion
Edible
skins?
part, yeah. It's like, for example, if you bought a pound of tomatoes, then wasting half a pound is what would be calculated there. Yeah, I think. Could be wrong. No, I don't think like the rind or the peel would count in that.
Yeah.
It's a lot. And a lot of these bigger I think somebody was talking about the packaging. A lot of the bigger facilities, they use all sorts of different new technologies for composting. So for example, if you're a supermarket and you have a box of strawberries that went bad, you have to kind of like, you're not going to necessarily be picking it all apart, you just toss it and plan on composting it. So they have these depackers where the machine kind of has these flails that separate the plastic container from the strawberries from the actual strawberries. So that's a nice kind of newer technology where you can separate the foreign objects from the organic material, and then have those streams either recycled or composted. And they also have a slurry method, which is basically kind of like blending everything together and then separating out anything that kind of flows through from things that are plastic or metal or whatnot. I think it's called slurrying. And another technology that I'm a little bit more interested in is dehydrators. So if you take any sort of fruit or vegetable, the bulk of the weight is water. So anywhere between 90-95% is water. And that water is what creates a problem for composters and people that transport the waste and so forth. So they have these machines now where they essentially bake the material at 400 something degrees, and 90% of it comes out as water. And then so what you're left with is like a dry coffee ground type material that's a lot easier to transport, and it's a lot easier to sort of manage in terms of smells and molds and so forth. I think that's probably going to be a bigger part of composting is all the technology. So whether it's dehydrators or depackers or slurry machines, that makes it a lot easier for whoever's doing the composting to actually do it in a somewhat cost-effective way. And there's also, you guys may have heard, but at least in Massachusetts, there's a law now where if you produce, I think it's half a ton of food waste a week, maybe it's a ton, I forget, but you're mandated to compost. You can't put it in the dumpster. So there's a lot of legislation and so forth that's promoting compost, and I think that's where a lot of this technology is coming about, because people are incentivized to sign up for grants and have different projects that promote composting. In my opinion, the dehydrator technologies I think would be the easiest to adopt, and it's also something that you can do at a much smaller scale at home. They have these small kind of tabletop composting systems now where you can create a easier material to handle instead of having a big pile of compost in your backyard. So I think that's pretty cool. It'd be interesting for a community that cares about sustainability and that cares about lowering their carbon footprint to have maybe some sort of central location where they can install a small or medium-sized dehydrator, and all of the food waste can be processed kind of locally opposed to being trucked somewhere. So I think there'll be a lot of that over time. And it's kind of a win-win, for people in the community that save on disposal fees and receive a material that's beneficial to their property.
Do you know whether they have dehydrators on a scale that could be put up at our transfer station, for example?
Yeah, they exist. Well, the interesting thing with those is you can have one that processes, 10 or 20 pounds, let's say every 24 hours, and they have ones that process, a ton or two every 24 hours. And in terms of scale, if you have a larger unit and it's still not large enough, you can just have multiple units. So, yeah, some place like the transfer station could use a piece of equipment like that. I think it'd be pretty cool. And then all you have left is just, the water, which you can just put down the drain. Anybody else have any thoughts, questions?
I'll say for us here, certainly the waste disposal companies don't like having food in materials. It's the landfill bulk
Right.
is there. It is a loss of valuable material.
Mm.
But also for us, our waste from the transfer station goes to a waste to energy facility.
Mm-hmm.
So they're burning waste to generate electricity. But all the food waste does is rob it of that extra electricity it could be producing because it's using up fuel in the other waste materials
Right.
to drive off the water from
Yeah, exactly.
food waste. So
Yeah, it's just kind of, it's a hassle, you know, on the front end of the homeowner to be separating it and having to take an extra step and doing something about it. But to the extent it can be a little bit of an easier process, I think it would encourage people to do it. So yeah, for the truckers, it's definitely more difficult to truck things around that are wet and that don't burn well. At the I think it's Covanta or something is the name of the company that does all of the
there are a few
yeah.
companies.
Yeah. So it's interesting to see how things will evolve over time. Because I think composting has always been done sort of on farms. It's just a natural step, you know, because you have waste from your operation and you don't want to do anything with it outside of the farm, so you just reuse it. And now it's becoming a little bit more of a mainstream thing where it's being done, you know, in households and in more urban environments because it's just not enough time and space to have it pile up, you know.
And when you do it at home, it doesn't take much. Because I lived in the city with a multi-family house, and everyone in the house contributed to a cubic yard bin
Yeah,
for years.
right,
That thing never filled up.
right.
I would occasionally pull something out and put it in the garden.
Yeah.
It's so much water.
It's amazing. Well, it's good and it's bad. It's, well, not bad, but it's good because it just reduces the amount of material you have to handle so much just by arranging it correctly. And it's not really bad, but like if you're producing compost, you know, you want, let's say, a cubic yard of material, but you end up with half a cubic yard or less of material, which is a little bit funny, but it's just the, you know, nature of it. So it's amazing how much it reduces in volume.
Sorry, I got to scoot.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for
Great.
comments. Something that I do at home with my compost, and what you can also do if you're curious, is to see if the material is finished. You would put in, you would plant let's just say for example 4 seeds of something that germinates really easily. I usually use radishes. Radishes germinate really quickly and really easily. And if at least 3 of the 4 seeds you planted germinate, that's a good sign that your compost is finished and nutritious. Radish test.
So I don't know what options you covered before I came in. Did you do the tumbler one?
Yep, we talked about, so just as a quick review,
Yes.
we started with the worm bin, which is kind of the smallest scale. You can do it at home with worms doing most of the work. And then we talked about the tumbler, which is sort of a intermediate style where you can do it outdoors, but you don't need a whole lot of space. It's also a nice method to do it to prevent critters, or pets from getting into the material. And it has 2 sections. You start one section, and once that section fills up, you start the next section. You have a staggered schedule of material. And then kind of the next step is the 3-bin or 4-bin composting, where you have larger bins of material. If you have a yard and you build them up and you flip them over, and you may take a month or so to fill up one of the bins, so you have a 3 to 4 month cycle. of producing material.
Okay. So, I don't think I'm brave enough to attempt that. What are your thoughts on number 2? Do you recommend it, or?
Yeah, this is sort of a more fancy version you can buy online. You just Google compost tumbler, but you can also just take like an old 5-gallon bucket or an old trash bin, and you can drill some holes into it to encourage the airflow, and then add to that, and then once in a while just sort of roll it around your yard and achieves the same result. But this is like a more high-end version. But it's probably the best version for most people that don't want to deal with potential pests, and also want to have something that's kind of able to handle some sort of volume.
Okay, one question.
Yeah.
I don't see the option there, but I have seen like adverts for those electric ones, like plug in the kitchen. What are
Yeah.
your thoughts on these ones?
So I don't have one of those myself, but as I understand it, it kind of grinds the material to make it smaller and also heats it up to dry it out. So it's not quite kind of finished compost per se, but it can be sort of an amendment to things so it could digest a little bit easier in your flower pot than if you were just to put raw waste into it. But the big part of it is just making it smaller, and then also taking some of the extra moisture out of it. And I think it's a great way to kind of help people, to facilitate people to compost on the front end and making it a little bit easier for them. So is anyone here going to go home and start doing some composting?
I might not want composting game.
What's that? Yeah, up your game a little
I
bit?
just throw it out in a pile and it does
Yeah.
its thing, and I occasionally go dig to the bottom.
I think if you have a little bit of a process going now, the easiest thing to do and the best thing to do is just to give it a little bit more air. So you do a pitchfork or a shovel and just kind of fluff it up, every week or so, if you haven't been doing it as often. And like once it starts going, it really accelerates. So plus you get a little exercise out of it. What do you think, Dorothea? Anything else?
I was, in my compost pile, I'm a little bit lazy and I don't do the turning over often enough, but as you explained, after 2 years, everything will be decaying anyways.
Yeah.
In my kind of like gardening life, I'm opening up my bin and I'm going to the bottom and I get the stuff out and then just amend it with the other compost that's already in the bed. And it works fine. I've never, I'm kind of like a low, I don't have enough time to do these things, to get it up to the right ratio, but eventually I think everything's gonna
Absolutely. Yeah.
meant together.
Everything will compost eventually. The tumbler is nice because instead of having to like manually fluff the pile, just give it a turn, and it does all the work. So for a lot of people, that's the easiest way to do it. And you could also, some people will dig a big trench and then put the material in there and then cover the trench up, a lot of times in between their garden beds. So if you have a row of vegetables growing, you kind of arrange that raw pile in the trench, and then next year, once that decomposes over the course of the summer, for example, you shift your garden bed over to where the path was, and then you have a row of composted material underneath that'll feed the roots. So that's another cool method that you could do if you have a vegetable garden. It's just alternate where you put the compost and where you plant the plants, and you'll always have fresh material. And you don't have to do the turning for that. Just bury it, which is pretty cool. Yeah.
So I am planning to attempt this one, buy the tumbler, and I can just start dumping stuff in it. and then turn it, like how often do I need to turn it?
I would give it, every time you put something into it, I would give it a little turn. That's probably the easiest way to keep track of it.
So when do you move stuff from one compartment to the other?
So you wouldn't move it from one to the other.
Okay.
You would wait until one fills up, and then just, you keep tumbling that, but you don't add anything to it. And then you add to the next section. And then after that fills up, hopefully the first section has sort of gotten more towards the finished state. And you take that out, and you put it on your garden, or wherever you want to use it. And then you start it again. So having the 2 bins allows you to have sort of like a head start on the next batch.
So it's not time-based, it's just the capacity, oh, it's full now. I guess.
Yeah, if it's full, it's full. And if it's not done, you have to let it finish.
Now, in terms of what I'm dumping in there, what should I pay attention to? Like I said, I'm just planning to just dump food waste in there. Do I need to like pay any particular attention to colors or?
I would focus on first on making sure that things that are not compostable don't get in. So if you have vegetables, you want to make sure the rubber bands are off and the twisty ties. And some people peel stickers off their fruit. So if you do the composting and the apple sticker stays on, it'll just still be there when the compost finishes. So just separating out anything that is not organic, that's definitely the step one. And then you also want to prioritize material that breaks down easier. So like bones from animals, that'll take a long time to break down. So you want to either give yourself enough time or not do it in that tumbler. Or even if you do let something through, you can usually find it afterwards, like a rubber band or a sticker.
Do I need to put water in it or nothing?
That's a good question. So if you take a handful of the compost and you squeeze it, it should have like 1 or 2 drops of water if you squeeze it really hard, kind of like a moist sponge. So if it doesn't have enough water, you would add a little bit of water to it. And if it's like dripping, then it's sort of drowning if it has too much water. So you'd want to just maybe put in some dry material like leaves to help balance it out. But it should be 1 or 2 drops. That's pretty important actually. Sometimes if a pile gets too wet, it doesn't work as well. Or too dry. Again, going back to kind of being living, breathing organisms to take care of them. But you can't see them. I think that pretty much covers it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you.
Sure.